Islam's Theft of Europe. Again. This is Ibn Alhuriya, Son of Freedom. This study points to the origins of Islam's gradual takeover of Europe that we presently see, elucidated in Bat Yor's books. The takeover of Europe is an example of civilization jihad at work. It will be shown that the creation of Utopia was the result of deliberate policies over considerable time and not a haphazard outcome. This civilization jihad involves the use of propaganda, psyops, and historical revisionism. It exploited Europe's need for oil and employs terrorism. The philosophy of multiculturalism was leveraged to gain concessions from an unsuspecting, altruistic, and idealistic Europe. Because the takeover of Europe was the product of deliberate policies, it should be expected that deliberate policies will also drive the effort to take over Canada, the Americas, and Australia. The inundation by immigration we see in Europe was not simply a naive multiculturalism at work. It was the incremental capitulation by European Union leaders to pressure from the OIC, that is the Organization of the Islamic Conference, as expressed through the EAD, the Euro-Arab Dialogue. The carrot the Islamists used was the dream of becoming a counterweight to the U.S. The stick was the threat of the cutoff of oil coupled with terrorism. When reading the policy statements coming from the conferences, one can see the code language at work to condition leaders' perceptions. All of this took place at the level of head of state and above. European leaders failed to exercise vigilance and to guard boundaries. European leaders failed to value their heritage and the gains that had been made by Western civilization. European leaders were regularly pressured to make concessions which slowly eroded the European identity. Each separate concession was rationalized as advantageous, but the cumulative effect was to erode the national identities. It is not surprising in hindsight that the OIC and its actors used the EU as a conduit. The very act of joining the EU is in some sense a relinquishment of national sovereignty. The OIC could then use this lowered boundary as a gateway for the imposition of its agenda. Sources of the study. Bat Yor's book, Utopia, the Euro-Arab Axis, and her book, Europe, Globalization and the Coming Universal Caliphate, and then Reliance of the Traveler, which is a compendium of Sharia law, and several policy documents found online authored by NGOs. In order to not violate the Fair Use Act of 1976, I will not break out the policy positions and analysis of each convocation, but refer the reader to the above books by Bat Yor. These books recount and analyze many high-level meetings since the early 1970s, which show the movement toward the current crisis in Europe. This presentation will seem to be missing something. It is missing the thread of all the policy decisions that were made from circa 1969 to the present, which have led to the Islamization of Europe. I leave it for Bat Yor's books to tell that story. What I will do is to distill some of her insights and offer my own analysis, enough to motivate you to want to read her books, which recount the step-by-step development of Utopia. My European friends will do well to use these books to develop historical sensitivity from which to formulate policies to preserve your national identities. The same applies to Canadians, Aussies, and Americans. You will notice that I refer to Islam like it was a person. This is not an accident. It has several functions. When a man wearing a beard and no mustache plows a truck into a crowd, screaming Allahu Akbar, he is not a violent extremist, a lone wolf. No, he is a jihadi warrior connected to the Ummah, that is the worldwide Islamic community, and motivated by the doctrine of jihad in Islam. The doctrines of Islam really do animate terrorism. What Westerners call terrorism, Islamic actors call jihad. By personalizing Islam, I mean to attribute blame to the source, the doctrine, and to not any particular Muslim. Islamic doctrine has a Lucifer effect on Muslims. In that sense, they are the victims of Islam. Because of violent supremacism and political imperialism is integral to Islamic doctrine, Islam, which is a religio-political doctrine, must be defeated on the level of doctrine. Presuppositions of this study. This study presupposes that Islam is best seen as a doctrine, an ideology, a civilization, and not merely a religion. It can be shown that Islam is supremacist and imperialistic in its view of the world. It can be shown that Islam teaches the use of violence, called jihad, to achieve its political aims. It must be understood that jihad, that is holy war, encompasses many tactics up to and including open warfare. It is the goal of jihad to enable Islam to rule the world politically. This can be shown from the Islamic canonical literature. American policy has focused too much on a military approach and a neglect of countering civilization jihad. Civilization jihad is more insidious than open warfare. Although it operates in plain sight, Islamic actors so control our language and perceptions that it is invisible to the eyes of most, including government officials. At the present time, the U.S. government, in its policy documents, especially from the Obama administration, completely masks the Islamic source of terrorism and masks the reality of civilization jihad. The warfighter is fighting blind due to policy from above. This is due to successful influence operations of Muslim Brotherhood operators who were embedded in the Obama administration. Goals of counter-jihad warriors. 1. Refuting the historical and theological basis of Islam. There is a growing body of literature that applies the historical critical method to the historical development of Islam, with the result of desacralizing it. 2. Formulating national security policy to inoculate America, Americans, and Westerners against Islamization. This area needs more systematic thought. 3. Strengthening and deepening our understanding and devotion to liberal democracy in all of its facets. See, for example, Karl Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies, and Ibn Warwick, Why the West is Best. 4. Studying the tactics and players of the enemy. At present, Islamic actors have so controlled the lexicon that we cannot even see the enemy in our midst. See, for example, Stephen Coughlin, Catastrophic Failure, Robert Spencer, Stealth Jihad, Andrew McCarthy, The Grand Jihad, Gabatz and Sperry, Muslim Mafia, Center for Security Policy, Sharia, The Threat to America. Which counter-jihadi warrior are you? One who primarily refutes Islam historically and theologically? One who studies and exposes jihadi actors or tactics? One who develops national security policy to counter jihad? One who defends and extends the theory of liberal democracy and shows its superiority to a 7th century theocratic theory? Salient themes, the beating drum. A visceral and continual anti-Semitism has governed all high-level consultations between the leaders of Europe and the Islamic world. Palestinians were morphed from a refugee, stateless population into a people deserving of a state, even though the representatives, the PLO, denied Israel's right to exist and repeatedly refused to negotiate with Israel. Oil was used by the Arab world as a weapon to intimidate Europe into making concessions and joining the Arabs in their anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism. Gradually, Arab bodies co-opted European bodies to steal away the national sovereignty of European member states. The left aided and abetted Islamic actors at every turn, not realizing that their freedom of expression would be the first casualty when jihad finally came. Islamic political and war doctrine. Islamic doctrine teaches that the world belongs to Allah and that it is the duty of Muslims to wage jihad until the Dar al-Harb, that is the house of war, becomes the Dar al-Islam. Here jihad, both kinetic and political warfare, and the final goal is the political subjugation of all the earth by Islam. Islam is a supremacist doctrine and therefore despises all other worldviews. It is the antithesis of tolerance. Ironically, the left uses multicultural arguments to defend Islam, not realizing that Islamic doctrine utterly rejects multiculturalism. The left appeals to tolerance to defend Islam, not realizing that it is Islam that is intolerant. Islam is just letting the left soften their nationalists. After Islam has liquidated the nationalists, Islam will finally liquidate the left as well. Islam is hiding behind its status as a religion while it functions as a political actor. Islam has succeeded in making it a crime to criticize it via UN Resolution 1618 as codified by EU states. The left has made it politically incorrect to criticize Islam by smearing criticism as hate speech. The term Islamophobia was a term invented by Islamic actors. It is meant to stop thought and criticism about Islam's connection to jihad and terror. The meaning of peace in Islam. Whenever reading declarations from conferences or consultations, it must be understood that when Islamic actors say peace, they do not mean the same thing as Western actors. When Islamic actors say peace, they mean that the non-Islamic party has either been converted to Islam or entered into dhimitude. By Dar al-Harb, House of War, Islamic actors are signifying their stance toward the entire non-Muslim world. The non-Muslim world to a Muslim is the object of conquest according to Islamic doctrine. Any non-Muslim who refuses the call, the dawah, to Islam is provoking war from the standpoint of the Muslim, and it is a righteous war. According to Islamic doctrine, Islam is in a permanent state of war with the world until the world converts to Islam or is vanquished. Curtain up on the tragedy of modern Europe. The history traced by Bat Yor's books is like a detective novel in that its downstream effects are enormous, as seen in the convulsing happening in Europe today. But prior to today's massive immigration and its effects, the general population of Europe did not see what was being done to their continent. The US, Canada, the Americas, and Australia should learn lessons from this story. Islamic actors are likely to be using similar tactics behind the scenes to take over your lands. Learn from the experience of Europe. If there was an explanatory memorandum like the one entered into evidence in the Holy Land Foundation trial in the U.S. District Court for Northern Texas 2008, then you can be sure that a similar strategy document exists for your country. Yes, for your country, or at least for your region. The various types of encroachment you see in your country are not an accident. Okay, I will continue to part 2.